The Ardennes Forest in December 1944 was not merely a battlefield. It was a cathedral of ice and jagged timber where the silence was more terrifying than the thunder of artillery. At 4:47 a.m. on December 19th, the temperature plummeted to a bone-chilling 8 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the breath of men into crystalline clouds that vanished into a milky, suffocating fog. 40 feet above the frozen forest floor, Private First Class Vincent Romano sat precariously in the crotch of a massive ancient oak tree, his body numbed by hours of immobility. His M1903A4 Springfield rifle, topped with a Weaver 330C scope, felt like a rod of dry ice against his cheek, the cold metal threatening to tear the skin through his wool face wrap. Below him, the world was a monochromatic blur of gray and white until the shadows began to move. 23 soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, fanatical, experienced, and emboldened by the chaos of the German breakthrough, drifted through the mist like ghosts. They were probing the American lines, looking for a weak point to exploit toward Malmedy. Romano peered through his optics, centering the crosshairs on a lead scout who had paused to light a cigarette. The match flickered, a tiny beacon of warmth in a world of death. Romano didn't think about his training or the impending court-martial. He thought about the math. He had only 6 rounds remaining in his immediate reach, and there were 23 targets below. As his fingers squeezed the trigger, the rifle's crack was swallowed by the dense fog, and the German soldier collapsed sideways into the snow, the cigarette still smoldering in his lifeless hand. 22 left. The echo of the shot hadn't even dissipated before the German squad scrambled for cover, diving into the deep drifts and firing blindly into the surrounding hillside. To them, the shot had come from nowhere, a phantom bullet from a phantom forest. Romano, however, remained as motionless as the bark of the tree he occupied. This was the moment where every shred of U.S. Army sniper doctrine dictated he should move. The manual was clear: fire 3 rounds and relocate to prevent triangulation by enemy counter-snipers and mortars. But Romano looked at the logging road below, the only artery through which German reinforcements and supplies could flow to the front, and he made a silent, mutinous decision. If he moved, the road would remain open. If he stayed, he was a dead man walking. He watched as the SS soldiers clustered together, a fatal mistake of the inexperienced, trying to determine the trajectory of the bullet. He worked the bolt with agonizing slowness, the metallic click muffled by the frozen air. He picked off the second, then the third, each shot delivered with a clinical precision that turned the logging road into a slaughterhouse. By the time the survivors realized the fire was coming from above rather than the ridge, Romano had already broken the cardinal rule of survival. The unexpected twist, however, lay in the briefcase of the officer he had just neutralized. The Germans believed they had stumbled upon an entire American platoon dug into the trees. They didn't realize that their advance was being halted by a single shivering kid from Brooklyn who had decided that the Army's shoot-and-move doctrine was a luxury he could no longer afford. He wasn't just defending a hill, he was rewriting the rules of engagement with every drop of blood that hit the snow.
Long before he was a ghost in the Ardennes, Vincent Romano was a predator on the skylines of Red Hook, Brooklyn. Growing up 3 blocks from the salt-crusted waterfront, the world was a grid of brick, soot, and survival. His father, a man with hands like worn leather from unloading cargo ships, and his mother, who vanished into Manhattan's skyscrapers to clean offices before dawn, left Vincent with the city as his playground. By age 12, while other boys were playing stickball in the crowded streets, Vincent was ascending rusted fire escapes with a borrowed .22 caliber rifle. The rooftops were his laboratory. He didn't just shoot, he studied. He learned that the pigeons he hunted for 15 cents apiece possessed a sensory awareness far beyond that of a human. If you moved a muscle too quickly, the flock scattered in a roar of wings. To succeed, Vincent had to become part of the architecture itself, blending into the chimneys and water towers for hours under the searing sun or the biting Atlantic wind. He learned to read the shimmer, the way heat rising from the tar paper distorted his sight picture at midday, and how to calculate the unpredictable gusts of wind that whistled between the tenements. By 14, he could put a bullet through a tin can at 200 yards with nothing but iron sights, a feat that drew the silent respect of the dockworkers who watched him from below. He wasn't just a marksman, he was a master of the still life, a skill that would eventually make him the most dangerous man in the Belgian woods. When the call of Pearl Harbor echoed through the docks, Vincent enlisted within 3 days, carrying his rooftop wisdom to the recruitment center. The Army was mesmerized by his scores. On his first qualification at Camp Perry, Ohio, he placed every single round inside the bullseye from 300 yards. He was a natural fit for the elite sniper school, but it was there that the friction began. The instructors preached a rigid bureaucratic doctrine, shoot and relocate. They insisted that a sniper's only shield was his movement, insisting that firing more than 3 shots from a single position was a death sentence. To the officers, a sniper was a hit-and-run asset, a mobile scout meant to harass the enemy and then vanish. Vincent listened to the lectures, but his mind kept returning to the pigeons of Red Hook. He knew that if you found the perfect perch, a position so elevated and so well concealed that the enemy couldn't even fathom its existence, mobility was actually a liability. He saw how other snipers like Miller and Sullivan would later die in Europe because they moved into predictable secondary positions that the German mortars were already ranging. The unexpected twist came during his final exam at Camp Perry. Vincent intentionally failed a movement drill by staying in one bush for the entire exercise, neutralizing the enemy team one by one as they looked for him at his supposed secondary locations. He was reprimanded for his arrogance, but as he stood on the deck of the transport ship bound for Normandy, he knew the Army was wrong. They were training soldiers to follow a manual, while he was preparing to become a permanent part of the landscape.
By December 16, 1944, the Ardennes had become a meat grinder of steel and ice. Hitler's last great gamble, Watch on the Rhine, struck with a ferocity that shattered the American lines in hours. 41 German battalions slammed into just 7 American battalions, and the resulting vacuum of power turned the dense forests near Rockerath into a labyrinth of chaos. Communication lines were severed, and entire platoons were swallowed by the fog and the relentless advance of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Vincent Romano's squad, 12 men of the 99th Infantry Division, found themselves retreating through knee-deep snow, the rhythmic thunder of German 88s chasing them like a physical weight. Their sergeant, Patrick O'Brien, a gritty South Boston construction worker who viewed the war as a series of structural problems to be solved, led them to a steep, timber-choked hillside overlooking a narrow logging road. This was the only viable route for German heavy equipment in the sector. They dug into the frozen earth, their shovels sparking against the permafrost, while the distant clatter of Maybach engines grew louder. The squad was isolated, their radio a hunk of useless plastic and metal destroyed in the initial barrage, and they were down to 3 days of rations. For O'Brien, the mission was simple: stay hidden, evade contact, and wait for a gap to slip back to friendly lines. But Romano, peering through his weaver scope at the empty road below, saw a different reality. As the first German motorcycle couriers and half-tracks began to trickle down the logging road, the tension in the foxholes reached a breaking point. The 12th SS were moving fast, their eyes fixed on the distant prize of Malmedy, oblivious to the 12 Americans watching them from the ridge. O'Brien enforced a strict order of silence, knowing that a single muzzle flash would bring a rain of mortar fire down on their heads. However, Romano began to map the German movement with the same cold, analytical precision he had used on the Brooklyn rooftops. He saw that the road was the Germans' jugular. Every squad using it brought the ammunition and intelligence required to sustain the breakthrough. The unexpected twist came when Romano realized that evading contact was no longer an option for the larger war effort. If they stayed hidden, the Germans would continue to flow unchecked, eventually encircling the very American reinforcements they were waiting for. Romano approached O'Brien under the cover of a moonless night, the air so cold it felt like glass in their lungs. He didn't ask for permission to retreat. He proposed a suicide mission. He wanted to turn the logging road into a dead zone, violating the Army's shoot and move doctrine by anchoring himself to a single tree to buy the American Army the one thing it couldn't manufacture: time. O'Brien looked at the road, then at the fanatical Hitlerjugend soldiers below, and finally at Romano. He realized that the quiet kid from Red Hook wasn't just planning to fight. He was planning to disappear into the wood and never come back. The night of December 17th was a hollow, frozen void where the only sound was the snapping of branches under the weight of the ice. While Sergeant O'Brien and the rest of the squad hunkered down in their shallow foxholes, Vincent Romano began his ascent into the heart of a massive oak tree, located 60 yards behind the squad's primary line. This wasn't just a climbing exercise, it was a cold-blooded engineering project. 40 feet up, where 3 thick boughs intersected, Romano found his perch, a natural platform that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the logging road 800 yards away. He worked in total darkness, his fingers fumbling with parachute cord as he lashed himself to the trunk, ensuring that even if he fell asleep from exhaustion or was stunned by a nearby blast, he wouldn't tumble to the forest floor. He stacked his meager supply of 20-round clips where he could reach them with minimal movement, arranged his pine bough camouflage to break up the silhouette of his Springfield, and positioned his wool blanket to trap what little body heat remained. The platform measured barely 3 by 4 feet, a cramped aerial cage that would be his entire universe for the next 72 hours. As he looked down at the logging road, now a silver ribbon under the pale winter moon, he felt a strange sense of detachment. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a component of the tree, a silent observer waiting for the first sign of movement in the gray dawn. At 6:23 a.m. on December 18th, the first light of day revealed the true scale of the slaughter Romano was about to initiate. The frost-covered world was silent until 6:47 a.m., when 6 SS soldiers appeared from the north, moving with a casual, arrogant gait that suggested they believed the sector was already cleared. They were young, their rifles slung over their shoulders, laughing as they walked. Perfect targets. Romano removed the cloth from his weaver scope, the glass biting into his eye socket. He adjusted for a minimal 3-mile-per-hour crosswind, took a half breath, and squeezed. The lead soldier dropped instantly, his body crumpling into the snow like a marionette with cut strings. The others scattered, but there was nowhere to hide. Romano had spent the night calculating every angle of that road. He fired again, then again, his movements mechanical and fluid, honed by years on the Brooklyn rooftops. By the time the 4th soldier fell, the survivors were firing blindly into the hillside, their bullets thumping harmlessly into the earth far below Romano's nest. The unexpected twist came when a second, larger group of 15 Germans rushed to the scene to investigate. Instead of finding an American platoon, they found a road littered with their dead and a silence that felt like a physical threat. Romano didn't hesitate. He began to work the bolt with a rhythmic, terrifying speed, realizing that by staying in this tree, he had become the telephone ghost of the forest, an invisible executioner who had just turned a vital German supply route into a graveyard.
By the morning of December 19th, the air around Romano's oak tree was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and the metallic tang of frozen blood. He'd been in the tree for nearly 36 hours, and the logging road below was a charnel house of 29 confirmed kills. The Germans, initially confused by the invisible Reaper, had finally adapted. No longer were they sending casual squads. They were now moving in disciplined skirmish lines, eyes glued to the ridges. Romano's hands were shaking from a combination of adrenaline and the onset of hypothermia, but he remained focused. When an officer attempted to direct a new formation with hand signals, Romano's Springfield barked once, and the German leadership vanished into the snow. The formation collapsed, but the silence that followed was different. It was heavy, calculated. Suddenly, the sharp rhythmic thump, 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 thump of 81mm mortars echoed from the northern bend of the road. The Germans had stopped guessing. They had triangulated his muzzle flashes and were walking a curtain of high explosives toward his sector. Romano pressed his body against the rough bark of the oak, tying his parachute cord tighter as the first salvo detonated 40 yards short. The ground groaned, and geysers of frozen earth and snow erupted into the gray sky. He was 40 feet up, trapped in a wooden tower that was rapidly becoming a lightning rod for German steel. The second salvo was a terrifying correction, shrieking through the air and exploding just 20 yards from the base of the tree. The shockwave rattled Romano's teeth, and the massive oak swayed like a mast in a storm, shedding frozen branches and bark. Shrapnel whistled through the air, shredding the pine bough camouflage he had so carefully arranged. Romano closed his eyes, waiting for the third salvo, the one that would surely sever the trunk or shred him where he sat. But the expected thunder never came. Instead, the distant hills rumbled with a deeper, more resonant boom as American 105mm howitzers roared to life. Unbeknownst to Romano, American counter-battery radar had picked up the German mortar positions and rained down a time-on-target strike that erased the mortar teams before they could finish their fire mission. It was a miracle of timing, a moment of pure blind luck that left Romano gasping for air in the sudden silence. As the smoke cleared, he didn't climb down. Despite the ringing in his ears and the splinters of wood embedded in his face, he reached for a fresh clip. The unexpected twist was his own reaction. Instead of fleeing the death trap, Romano realized that the Germans' desperate attempt to kill him was proof that his mission was working. He wasn't just a sniper anymore. He was a strategic blockade, and as long as he drew breath, the road belonged to him.
By the morning of December 20th, Vincent Romano had been anchored to the oak tree for over 60 hours, and the line between reality and the frozen void was beginning to dissolve. The mercury had bottomed out at 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and hypothermia was no longer a threat, it was an occupant of his mind. His feet had long since transitioned from agonizing pain to a terrifying, woody numbness, and his hands moved with the heavy, sluggish rhythm of a dying machine. In the pre-dawn gray, the shadows of the forest began to play tricks on his exhausted brain. He saw the pigeons of Red Hook fluttering between the pines, and for a fleeting moment, the smell of his mother's cooking replaced the scent of cordite and pine needles. He was dying in the sky, his cognitive functions slurring as he struggled to remember why he was tied to a tree in Belgium. Yet the road remained empty, a silent testament to his 72-hour vigil. The psychological toll was broken only when the rhythmic clatter of engines signaled the Germans' final desperate attempt to clear the artery. This wasn't a squad or a patrol, it was a full platoon of 41 soldiers supported by 2 half-tracks charging the kill zone with everything they had. The Hitlerjugend had decided that if they couldn't kill the phantom in the tree, they would simply overwhelm him with sheer mass.
The assault was a symphony of chaos. Machine guns from the half-tracks raked the hillside, filling the air with a hailstorm of lead and splintered bark that forced Romano to press his face into the frozen moss of the trunk. He didn't wait for them to close the distance. He began firing at 900 yards, his shots guided more by instinct than his blurred vision. He targeted the lead half-track, putting 3 rounds through the driver's vision port. The vehicle swerved violently, crashing into a snowbank and spilling infantry into the open. Romano worked the bolt with mechanical desperation, his mind clearing under the sudden surge of adrenaline. He picked off the gunner of the second half-track, then began systematically thinning the ranks of the charging infantry. He was no longer a man, he was a surgical instrument of the American system, exploiting the bottleneck of the logging road. By 8:09 a.m., the snow was stained a deep, visceral crimson, and the survivors of the platoon were retreating in disarray, leaving 18 bodies tangled in the brush. The unexpected twist came at 3:15 p.m. when the first scouts of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division reached the sector. When they found Romano, he wasn't celebrating. He was still tied to the tree, staring blankly at his rifle, his body so frozen into a crouch that he had to be physically pried from the branches. He had won the battle of the road, but he had lost the ability to feel the ground beneath his feet. The transition from the frozen silence of the oak tree to the claustrophobic heat of a requisition farmhouse was a jarring descent for Vincent Romano. On December 21, 1944, he sat in a dim room 5 miles west of the front, his feet wrapped in thick bandages and his body shivering uncontrollably despite the heavy wool blankets draped over his shoulders. Across the scarred wooden table sat Captain James Buchanan, a cold, analytical battalion intelligence officer, and Major Harold Steinberg of division operations. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the distant, rhythmic rumble of heavy artillery. Buchanan opened a folder, his eyes fixed on the staggering report. 87 confirmed kills in 72 hours, all from a single static position. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he leveled a gaze of sharp bureaucratic steel. Romano walked them through the engagement with a flat, hollow tone, detailing the wind adjustments, the leadership eliminations, and the tactical shutdown of the logging road. However, the mood soured when Steinberg brought up the violation of standing operating procedure. Romano had fired over 100 rounds from a single tree, ignoring direct orders to relocate after 3 shots. To the officers, he wasn't just a marksman, he was a cowboy whose reckless disregard for doctrine could have drawn enough mortar fire to erase his entire squad. The question looming in the room was whether Romano was a hero to be decorated or a liability to be court-martialed for insubordination. The debate between the 2 officers reflected the fracture in American military thinking during the crisis of the Bulge. Buchanan argued that punishing Romano would crush the morale of a division already pushed to the breaking point, while Steinberg insisted that the shoot and relocate rule existed to protect millions of dollars in military assets, the soldiers themselves. Romano, however, remained unfazed, his voice rasping from the cold. He looked Steinberg in the eye and stated that command wasn't present to assess the ground truth, and that he had made the only decision that would save American lives by paralyzing the German logistics tail. The room went silent as Steinberg studied a map of the sector, realizing that the distribution problems previously reported by German units were in fact the work of this one shivering private. The unexpected twist came when Steinberg stood up, not to arrest Romano, but to announce that his violation would be forwarded to the division sniper school for tactical analysis. There would be no court-martial, but there would be no public medal either. Instead, Romano was given a formal reprimand for his service record, a black mark that would follow him forever, paired with a secret acknowledgement that he had fundamentally changed how the army viewed defensive sniper employment. He had won the argument on the ground, but in the world of the men in suits, he remained a ghost who had simply gotten lucky. The war ended for Vincent Romano not with a parade, but with the quiet click of a suitcase in a Red Hook hallway. By September 1945, he was back in Brooklyn, the salt air of the waterfront finally scrubbing the scent of frozen pine and cordite from his lungs. He took a job as an aircraft mechanic at LaGuardia Airport, finding solace in the methodical, silent work of maintaining engines, a world where nothing was hidden in the fog and nobody was trying to kill him. He married Teresa, raised 3 children, and lived a life of deliberate anonymity. To his neighbors, he was just a disciplined man who fixed cars in his garage and taught his grandkids to shoot .22s at upstate ranges with a strange, unwavering patience. He never spoke of the 99th Division, the oak tree, or the 87 men he had erased from the logging road. When his children asked about his service, he would simply say he was infantry, shifting the conversation before the memories of the frozen Ardennes could take root. Every December 20th, however, he would step away to make a 20-minute phone call to Patrick O'Brien in Boston. They never discussed the tactical significance of the static defensive position or the reprimand in Vincent's file. They only spoke of their families, 2 survivors of a nightmare who shared a secret bond forged in the shadow of a Belgian forest. The legacy of the Brooklyn sniper remained buried in classified personnel files until long after the logging road had been paved over by modern Belgian highways. In 1973, at a rare division reunion, a young Vietnam-era instructor named Michael Greco approached Romano, revealing that the static defensive position was now a core module in the Army's sniper curriculum, a doctrine born directly from the tactical analysis of the Ardennes engagements. Romano had been a pioneer of the very system that had once threatened him with a court-martial. He died quietly of a heart attack in 1997, sitting in a chair in his garage, a man who had successfully transitioned from a ghost of the forest back into the fabric of the city. The unexpected twist came years later, when a Belgian military historian discovered the 12th SS Panzer Division's war diaries. The records spoke of a terrifying phantom that had crippled their logistics in Sector 7B, forcing a 2-mile reroute that added 6 hours to their timetable. 6 hours that allowed American reinforcements to solidify the line. There is no monument to Vincent Romano on that road, and his name was redacted from the official doctrinal papers. Yet every modern sniper who learns to hold a position against the odds is an echo of the boy from Red Hook who refused to move.